Hey everybody, welcome to Q Plus EDU. My name is Frederick, my pronouns are they, them. I am Out Youth Texas Gender and Sexuality Alliance Network Coordinator, and I am here today to be doing the recording and back-end stuff for the Zoom, and I'll be dropping links in the chat throughout as well. I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, who's going to be moderating today.
Thank you, Frederick. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, especially those of you whose faces I have not seen in far too long. My name is Catherine Gonzalez. I'm the Operations and Programs Director at Out Youth. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I will be helping moderate today's panel on library queries. All three of today's guests have something very unique in common, but I will let them get to that in a moment. First, as is tradition at Out Youth, let's go around and do introductions. Love for you to say your name, your pronouns, how you were involved in Out Youth in the past, and what it is that you do now, what your current affiliations are. Once that's done, then we'll do the question of the day. I'll start with Alistair.
Hi everyone, my name is Alistair Womack. I use they, them pronouns. I am currently Out Youth's librarian and archivist and have been for almost 3 years now. And I also work at the University of Texas at the Benson Latin American Collection.
Ashley.
Thank you. I'm Ashley Morrison. I use she, her pronouns. I had the pleasure of being Out Youth's volunteer librarian for a little over a year, just before Alistair. I currently also work at the University of Texas at Austin as the Talker Open Education Librarian.
Brian.
My name is Brian Kundy. My pronouns are he, him, his. I was with Out Youth as a librarian from 2010 to 2016, a very long time. I currently work as a child and family therapist with Integral Care, and I'm also the culture and operations director for a nonprofit called GamerX that does some things with LGBTQ+ folks in culture and the video game industry.
Thank you all. So if it wasn't abundantly clear, the thing that the three of these people have in common is that they have helped run the Out Youth Library, the Jerry Strickland Jr. Memorial Library, for a combined decade. It is our unique honor at Out Youth to host the library, which, to our knowledge, is the largest privately managed collection of LGBTQ books and media in the state of Texas. Not saying that all of it is great. And I'm sure that Brian will get to that in a moment. We have had some very interesting times together managing that library. Let's get to our question of the day. What was your first experience with queer media in a library setting? What was it? How did it make you feel to find it? I will let you raise your hand to tell me who's going first. Ashley.
Sure, I'll go first. I was thinking back about this, and I wish I could say that I had encountered it when I was young in public libraries, but I don't remember it unless you're counting a very queer reading of Anne of Green Gables, as I think probably others have had too. So the first memory I could actually recall was when I was in my first year of college at the University of Texas at Austin, and I was preparing to write one of my very first research papers on queer representation in television. And I remember being fearful that I just wouldn't be able to find any books on the topic, which seems kind of laughable now. But at the time, as an 18-year-old in a library, I didn't really know where to start with that. I remember searching for it and encountering this really large collection and being able to browse the shelves and thinking, oh, other people are writing about this thing that seemed entirely niche to me at the time. And not only is there a lot of queer literature out there, but people are treating this with importance. It's an academic and intellectual topic, and at the time that felt really validating and gratifying, so it just was really meaningful to me then.
Alistair.
Hi, I can go next. So my first experience also wasn't until I was in college. I grew up in a very rural community, so we didn't have a lot of access to libraries. and or B, I didn't realize that until I was in college. And I had actually gone back home to work at my county's public library, and I found the only book that was overtly gay was a book from 1994 called Homosexuality and Gay Rights, part of a series called Ideas in Conflict. And it was just like a giant pros and cons list of like being gay. And it wasn't great to be the first thing that I experienced, but it was also, I think, nice because then I got to recognize that like people are in control of collections and you have to really put into it what you want to see reflected. And it really pushed me to, you know, realize that I could bring representation for other people. So it wasn't great, but overall in the long run, very informative.
So I'm actually realizing how lucky I was now. My first encounter with queer material in a library space was at 16 in my high school library. And this is a high school that didn't even have a GSA until 2012. This was back in like 2003. And I found Rainbow Boys by Alex Sanchez, and I thought it was a mistake. They must not have actually checked what this book was about, because it just, I'm like, no. So I stacked it up with like other fiction novels and like, oh, we'll just check all these out, no big deal. But I think now as an adult, I realize that that was probably a very strategic decision by a librarian to put that book into a school that didn't talk about these things, in the hopes that people like me would find it.
I will share my own experience. I don't know that my colleagues on this call actually know this. The first time that I encountered queer media in a library was at Out Youth in 2005. So it has a very long legacy. I am going to share another story that I think is entirely relevant before we get into the meat of the Q&A. Libraries have been instrumental in Out Youth's history from the very beginning. When we were founded in 1990, the internet was barely a thing. And if you had the internet, it was very slow and it made a terrible noise. So to our knowledge, Out Youth did not have a website until the mid to late 90s. So you might ask yourself, how did we get the word out? We photocopied our flyers and then sent our volunteers into public libraries across Austin. And they would slip the flyers for Out Youth in between the pages of LGBTQ themed books. And in some cases, even take every dictionary off the wall and slip the flyers into the pages where youth might find the definition for words like lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. So libraries have been core to our work, which leads wonderfully into our first question. Now that we live in an age when people carry around supercomputers in their pockets that talk to space, and they literally have access to a world's information, why are libraries still important?
So it's really hard for me to narrow down an answer to this question because, like so many of us on the call today, this is what we've dedicated a lot of our lives to. Catherine, you put it well. People are able to access tons of information very quickly, very freely in many cases, but that's still a bit nuanced. One, not everybody has that supercomputer in their pocket still, and libraries are the place that they can go to access the internet, to check out books, to check out movies, TV shows, other media, where they'll hopefully see themselves represented. The other downside of all of that information being so immediately accessible to anybody is that it is not curated, I suppose would be the nice way to put it. Some of it is really helpful, and some of it is not helpful and very damaging, and librarians and other information professionals still play a really important role in connecting people to answers to their questions through sources that they can trust. So that's a big part of why I enjoy being a librarian and why I think libraries are so important.
I'll kind of just echo what Ashley said. I mean, we do have access to wonderful information, which is great, but also having access to a person who's just been trained to teach you and help you access information, including information that might not be so readily available for people in like more marginalized communities. For example, I think just having that physical space also to go and explore kind of whatever, like to figure out whatever you want in this kind of free space where you can like browse a shelf or get on a computer or look through the movies or the CDs. I think it's just like this really wonderful space in general, and very important, obviously.
Yeah, a quick echo the curating part. That was a challenge when I transitioned the library from one format to another downstairs, and it was a constant struggle to find current and accurate books on health topics, especially at the time, like trans health, like good books for that. They were expensive. Like they weren't things we could just go out and buy casually. And as a clinician now, I still run into clients who just they have like accurate-ish information, but it's not accurate enough to be safe, or it's misinformation. Well, I found it on the internet, I found it on Instagram. Like, oh, if only like there'd been a book you could readily go get at your school library, right? And then the other thing is, librarians have an important role in introducing new books, concepts, ideas that folks may not have gone and looked for on their own. In terms of like not just fiction but nonfiction authors, things like that. We kind of expand folks' horizons.
I'm thankful to Ashley for pointing out the piece of not everyone is privileged enough to have access to a supercomputer that they carry around in their pocket. Admittedly, I asked the question to poke the bear. Well, all three bears. The reason why we at OutYouth and the Texas GSA Network still hold libraries very dear is for all of the reasons that the three of you have pointed out, and for something that most people don't think about, which is libraries, especially in middle schools and high schools, are a place of refuge for queer students. Oftentimes, librarians are queer themselves or very queer friendly. Oftentimes, when we need to get into a school in some way or another in order to advocate for students there, their rights, their safety, their comfort, their right to an equitable education, it's usually the librarian that we call first. And much like Brian has pointed out, I have no doubt that you came across Rainbow Boys not because it was an accident, but because it was very much intentional. That someone cared enough about queer youth to find that book and put it in the collection, knowing that you would come across it. So knowing that we hold these spaces near and dear for both access to curated information, because yes, there is nothing that drives me up a wall as a professional working with trans and non-binary youth especially, when people say, well, I read it on the internet. Or I do actually appreciate when somebody comes in and says, well, I've done all the research on the internet, but these two things don't agree. So which one is true? That piece of critical thinking and having a curated collection is important, plus this piece of refuge. So for those watching this who either are librarians or want to make a library that they know more safe and welcoming for LGBTQ+ youth and the community at large, what can be done? What do they need to think about? Both the obvious and the things that you may miss, because those are always my favorite. And don't say start a collection at a local LGBT youth center. That is cheating. Alistair.
I can go first with kind of an obvious one for me is, I think like physical signage, and not necessarily like overtly saying like, hey, I mean, that's also great. But if you're in a space where you can't overtly say like, hey, we're queer friendly or like whatever, just popping a rainbow up will do wonders. I think that like, it's something that I notice myself when I go into spaces, is like looking for signage and stuff in like kind of subtle ways. Something else that you can do personally is like wearing pronoun pins or introducing yourself with pronouns at the checkout desk or when you're doing reference. I think that also goes a long way to show that you're both aware of it and like open to receiving maybe potentially like neo-pronouns or gender-neutral pronouns, and will use them accurately and make that student or patron like feel seen. And then also just like making sure people are represented on the shelves in various formats, I think is really important.
I will certainly get to queering a collection in a moment. Brian.
So I do a lot of event work. I work on some conventions, and the thing I've learned doing that is being very intentional in the way you write, like the rules about your space and the code of conduct about your space, and being explicit even about what is and isn't acceptable. I know librarians have a lot of power in schools to say these are the library rules. You can slip in there that, you know, slurs and comments based on sexual orientation, gender identity, things like that are not acceptable, right? Or some other age appropriate thing, like, you know, I know Out Youth uses like don't yuck my yum, right? Like the idea that like just because you don't like these books does not mean you need to trash people for them. And I think we'll all appreciate the idea like you can't be subtextual about these kinds of boundaries. You have to be very explicit. You have to be textual about it, right? And that like, no, these specific things are not going to be okay in this library space, because what that tells a queer student is that if I'm in this space, I have recourse if this starts to happen here. If I start to be harassed, I am explicitly allowed to go, this is a rule and they're breaking it, and get adult intervention.
I'll echo, Alistair provided a really good example of something that was successful in my last library as well. We proposed to our administration that we should print our pronouns on our library badges for those who are working at the desk. And that didn't go over well, but what did go over well, weirdly, was producing pins. So we created buttons and made those available to staff working at the desk to share our pronouns with each other and with patrons. And I share this again only because it had the really unexpected and heartwarming outcome that our patrons started asking for them. So we ended up producing more pronoun pins and just made them freely available at the desk, and patrons took them all the time, which was great to see. So I just wanted to share another story around that. I think that the other thing that I think about when it comes to safe and welcoming spaces, and each of you touched on this as well, is representation. I think that librarians have a great opportunity when it comes to displays. So collections, small collections typically of books that are on a particular topic or theme or by certain types of authors. And often you already see this in libraries around Pride time. And I think that that's great. But it's also othering in a way to only do Pride displays. I think that when you have the opportunity to create displays, making sure that you have authors and stories that are representative of your diverse patron populations is really important. So if you're developing a romance display and you only have heteronormative stories, you're really missing an opportunity to reflect the patron demographics back to them and expose people to new types of stories that they may not have sought out explicitly in the past. I think that that's an opportunity as well.
Yes, and we are going to dive deeply into, I am hoping, some minutia. I would love to hear some library speak for the librarians especially who are wondering how to do this in a moment. But I want to really focus on what Ashley just said. I am not sure if anyone else is aware or has seen this online, but I am living for it. I don't know who is behind this, who is organizing it, but are you all aware that this month, August, is Black History Month? It was also Black History Month in July and June and May. Are you catching on? People have been taking advantage of perhaps the public's lack of awareness of these awareness months and when they traditionally happen, and instead are going viral for announcing that August is Black History Month, for example. And all of that is to point out that, as we have been saying for years, Black history is important every day of the year, and always has been. To relegate it to 1 month is all sorts of words that I am not allowed to say on a webinar for Out Youth. And it's the same that, and I'm glad that Ashley, that you pointed out the romance angle of this. It's something that we encounter a lot with our young adults at Out Youth, that it's hard to develop romantic relationships because we didn't get to have them and we didn't get to see them in media, whether that's books, TV, TikTok, any of these other places that we are consuming media. So thinking about how a library collection can be curated to be queer, what are things to be looking at? How do you do that?
So as folks may have caught on, I'm not actually a professional librarian. I have a minor in literature, so I came at this from well, what do I know about libraries and what do I know about literature as a layperson? And the biggest thing I did was, well, we have lots of books, specifically in terms of fiction, on like cis white gay men and cis white gay women. And my first thought was, well, that can't continue. My background's in sociology. There's way more to being queer than that. And so I think when you approach it as queer, ask yourself, well, what queer experiences am I including? I'm sure Alistair and Ashley could speak more to this than I could, but my impression has been, and my experience, my sister's a youth librarian for public library, is that as an industry, libraries are also exceedingly white. And that requires, challenging yourself on what you consider to be part of any given experience, like with the romance thing, but it goes beyond that. And so, we did a lot around, well, we need fiction that has, not just trans and bisexual and intersex and other genderqueer voices, but different experiences of those than like white. And that was a challenge. Like we had to really look for some of these books.
Before you both chime in, sorry, we're going to go on a bit of a tangent. I didn't plan for this. So at the beginning of quarantine, and let's also acknowledge, because I fully intend that I will be watching this like 20 years from now and laughing at, oh my gosh, how young all of us were, and back when libraries were, anyway, back when libraries weren't everywhere. My actual future vision is that there will be a library on every corner like a Starbucks. We'll get to that in a minute. When quarantine started, self-isolation, stay-at-home orders, we started story time at Out Youth. And one of the very first things I did was I went to Book People, Austin's local independent bookseller, and went upstairs to the youth section and said, so I work at Out Youth, I'm gonna do story time, I need queer YA that is new, that we wouldn't have in our library already. Pet by Akwaeke Emezi features a Black, deaf, trans girl as the heroine in a harrowing horror sci-fi thriller. It is one of the top 10 books that I've ever read. And it was a joy to purchase this to add to our collection for exactly the reasons that Brian is mentioning, because it has been so difficult to find and add this kind of content to the library, partly because I'm white. I don't necessarily have an awareness of, and certainly work to, but have an awareness of where BIPOC queer literature is being produced and available. And to have it freely available on the shelves of a local bookseller and to have the person helping me say, this is the best the best YA I've ever read, very impactful. So I guess there's also kind of a sub-question in there for all of you around, you're curating it, how do you make those suggestions as well? So kind of the full life cycle is what I'm getting at, from identifying that we have a problem to where do we find them, how do we add them to the collection, then how do we get them into the hands of people who need it?
So that was something that I really enjoyed spending time with when I was at Out Youth. Brian had already created such an amazing collection. The luxury that I think we had as Out Youth is that we were able to rely really heavily on donations. We have a community that will give us a lot. I remember getting the like boxes and boxes of books to go through and finding a lot of real gems in there. But I think that our collection has largely been built that way. Depending though on the donors and their interests and tastes, it can create a collection that, well, in our case was very adult heavy. I don't mean that in the adult sense of the word. I just mean this was not YA content in a lot of cases. It's not what all teenagers want to read. It's very much what some teenagers, myself included, wanted to read, but because we rely heavily on donations, we had to be pretty intentional about using whatever funds we did have to go out and collect really specifically those stories that would speak to our youth, both in terms of reading level and the stories that they might enjoy, but also the types of characters represented, the authors represented. And the book Pet that Catherine just shared is a great example of the kind of thing that if you aren't intentional about seeking it out and collecting it, might go missing from your collection, particularly if you're relying on donations. I felt really lucky that when we did identify titles along those lines through Goodreads, that was one of my favorite sources. There are lots of other websites where you can go and look for well-reviewed YA, all kinds of books, but YA was what I was focusing on. I would add them to our library's Amazon wish list, and we would get pretty much everything that we put on that list. So we were very fortunate in that way. And I know not every library is in that position, but being really intentional about seeing what's missing from your collection, because it's really easy to take a look at what's there, but you have to really make time to think about what isn't there and who isn't represented and build around that if you do have the funds to do so, or if you can solicit those specifically from donors.
Yeah, and just kind of going off of that, I think what Ashley said was great. I also kind of inherited this already built collection, which was super nice because I didn't have to start anything from the ground up. It's also much easier to identify holes that way if you're not having to just try to find as many books as possible. So that's been really easy on my end, as far as like being able to identify and kind of try to fill those holes in the collections. Something that I think that's important, that I've been trying to really focus on for Out Youth currently is the accessibility of the collections and trying to make sure that they're easily searchable for the youth that are trying to find it. And one of the things that I've been using is tags in Library Thing, which is our catalog that we use. And being able to have the freedom of curating your own tags and using words and phrases that the youth are very familiar with, it makes it much easier for them to find materials where they can see themselves. And it's much easier to navigate than trying to like go through the rigidness of Library of Congress or Dewey and having like specified search terms that aren't great and are pretty outdated. So I think just like finding new and nuanced ways to get the materials out is also something important, and I think something that maybe is missed a little bit when you're thinking about collecting, because I think sometimes it's like, okay, cool, I've got the book on the shelf, moving on to the next one, but you also have to make sure that people can find the books that you've gone through all the trouble of curating.
Actually circled back. Well, I'm glad Brian wants to chime in. Brian, I have a question for you related to what you said earlier. So you found Rainbow Boys in your high school library. Mm-hmm. Where was it?
It was just in the regular fiction section. There was no special section on this. I got real good in the high school library about basically going and finding like 3 or 4 novels that I could use to read instead of doing what I should have been doing, like any good teenager. And I just, one day I saw Rainbow Boys, I'm like, okay. Like, I looked, I'm like, no, okay. It was just there. It was there as part of the regular collection. And I think, again, it was strategic. I think seeding this stuff where it's going to be found is really important. A thing that has always really bothered me is like, you know, you go to a bookstore, like used to be Borders, right? And there'd be like, here's literature and here's Black literature. And I'm like, oh, but it's still literature. No one who is not looking for Black literature is going to go to that section. They're just not. Like it's a conscious thing they're doing. And the problem is that that's the audience that you don't need to reach. They already get it. Whereas if this was in regular literature, right, like that's helpful. I'm not sure what it is now. I haven't worked in the library at Out Youth in years. But, fiction was fiction. It wasn't lesbian fiction, gay fiction, fiction by X authors. And I think it was a very conscious choice. And the only time we sorted by specific identities was for nonfiction, because at that point, that's part of what folks are looking for, is facts. The other thing I want to springboard on real quick on that is we talked a little about like donations and how donations can be difficult to build a collection off of because it reflects more your donor base than your population. Don't be afraid, I would tell folks, to say, I'll take everything. Take whatever you want to give me. Not all of it's going to go into the collection, but all of it will be used to build the collection. And what that, it was a paradigm shift I worked really hard to make, and that you can give me all these books, and maybe I don't need them, or they're inappropriate, or I have 6 copies already, but I can turn around and take those books to half price, and I can liquidate them, and that becomes money to go buy books we need. Sometimes from half price for really cheap, depending on what they are. And I became known as the gay books guy at half price in North Lamar. I was known by that at one point. Like, he's the guy who just brings gay books in every 2 months. But that's part of how we found those things. We just took everything we could, and the stuff that we could use when in the collection, the stuff that we didn't, we just made it clear we appreciate it, but it's going to be turned into other books.
Yes, and I want to point out that I think the brilliant piece of the work that these 3 librarians have done, and the librarians that came before them, because Ashley and Alistair have also mentioned that they have inherited a great collection. Brian did too, correct, Brian? Because the library was started in the 90s.
Yeah, it was big. It was a thing where like there was like 2 or 3 months, as you recall, where when we began transitioning it, I just sat there like organizing and weeding it because it just hadn't been sorted in a while, and it was massive.
Yeah. So we've talked about, going to end here, which segues us nice into the next question. The brilliance of curating the collection at Out Youth. And it also makes this piece of donor relations for a nonprofit library a lot easier. The rule of the Out Youth Library is that we collect and curate anything that is by, for, or about queer people. And using that as the frame has been so helpful. The other thing that I want to point out and make sure that is given voice in this is something that I heard from the former president of the Human Rights Campaign, when he would talk about our community. And the beauty of the LGBTQIA plus community is that we touch every community. We are represented and representative of all sorts of people all over the world. So even using that simple frame of by, for, or about queer people, that opens up all sorts of other avenues into intersex studies. Absolutely imperative, and I will own that our collection is still lacking. QT, BIPOC, literature and nonfiction. The sociology aspect of how intersectional identity plays into what it means to be queer. So, we're adding all of these things, and to be quite frank, Q plus EDU has not shied away from controversial topics. And we have not been without a deal of backlash online for the topics that we've chosen to cover in Q plus EDU, which begs the question. I know Brian and I went back and forth on this about 1,000 times. You now have done this as a librarian. You've gone through your collection, you've identified the gaps, you've brought in the stuff, you've tagged it or not tagged it, depending on what kind of environment it is, and then somebody finds out that you have, God forbid, put literature in your library that represents people. And now they're angry. There is backlash. What do you do? Ashley?
I can start this, but I'll provide the disclaimer that given the settings that I've worked in between Out Youth and primarily academic libraries, it's not something I've personally had to encounter much. Youth going to Out Youth, their parents probably have a pretty good idea of what they might encounter in a library for queer youth. So I feel fortunate that it wasn't something I personally encountered. But I want to go back, Catherine, to something that you mentioned earlier, which was the collection development policy. Out Youth collects literature that is by, for, or about queer people. And being able to go back to that collection development policy, while it may not make somebody feel less angry, it's really important. Not every library has a documented collection development policy, and to deal with these challenges is one way in which that ends up being valuable, just to point back to it and be explicit about who you're collecting for and what types of materials you're collecting. The other thing that I touched on there was having a process to respond to challenges that one receives. So when somebody has a complaint about the collection and the materials that you're making available, how are you going to deal with it? For example, a lot of libraries' policies say that we don't deal with those complaints in person. You're going to fill out a form, or you'll give us a call or shoot us an email, and you know, that takes a little bit of the heat off of an in-person interaction to be able to say in the moment, we absolutely have a process to deal with this, and here's how you submit a challenge. A challenge process also often includes the obligation that the person making the complaint read the material in its entirety, which can also help contextualize things. One, a lot of people are not going to take that step, and it kind of dies down from there. But if they do choose to read all of it, it might contextualize it a bit more and de-escalate some of the concerns they had about the content.
Alistair?
I can kind of jump in. I want to echo everything that Ashley said, because that was amazing. I think having like well-defined collection development policies and like practices in place is the way to go. I also just want to throw in there that you can look at professional organizations that you might be a part of or that are in your state or community. I know that in the American Library Association professional ethics, they talk about not censoring. They also have a Rainbow Roundtable, and I think that they have some resources to help with like backlash. This was something that was brought up when the Leander librarian was fired for drag queen story time. And I know that myself and a few other grad students got together and we were planning our own drag queen story time and inviting her as a speaker before all of this happened. But I think like reaching out to your professional organizations and other professionals in your area to kind of get some support, even if it's just like, hey, did I do this? Am I doing this wrong? Like, am I actually the one that should be changing? And I think like just reaching out to people is another great way to deal with the backlash.
I'm again going to echo, have a written policy. That was a thing I was real big on when I took over, is that there was no written policy. I'm like, oh no, this won't protect us. There's nothing written we can point back to. I've had some experience in the past. I'm big into comics, with the way Texas decency laws play out. And so familiarizing yourself with what the sort of legal code is around like distribution of media, and knowing, what is and isn't actually against the law and ways you can get in trouble. For those who don't know, Texas decency laws, as I recall them when I was working around this, was essentially that in practice, in theory, not in practice, a minor can get a hold of explicit material. The person who allowed that to happen can be in trouble. And so just being conscious of that and what, defenses are there. Something I was big on, well, if it's sex education, right? Like it's education. If it's erotica, well, that probably shouldn't have been a library in the first place. And that's the thing we're going to have to go ahead and own and remove. And that comes back to like that process around curating, right? You have to be very conscious and intentional about what goes on the shelves. I cannot tell you how many times I got a donation box and most of it was completely inappropriate for children. Completely, like not by any stretch of the imagination. I spent a whole summer once going through literally 300 to 500 books of lesbian erotica. trying to find the ones that I could just say, these are romantic, this is gonna be okay, I can keep these. There were not a lot. It was a fun summer. It doesn't mean reading every book in back to back, but like looking it up, going through it. Goodreads is great, has lots of tags on these things to help you get an idea of the content, the age rating. And this is difficult because a lot of queer media, especially queer media that's not modern, being queer by default made it adult content, whether or not it actually was. And so you can't always trust what the spine or the back of the book says, unfortunately. You have to really do your research on it. And then once you've done that, you're in a better position to defend it. You can say, well, but it's not explicit. It's not inappropriate, it's just queer.
Which by default is read as adult. And that's a whole other conversation. So one of the things I'm very interested in, and this is where I would like to acknowledge publicly that we are going off script at this point, because based on where this conversation has taken us, I have some curiosities about libraries in the future. So, especially in the time of COVID-19 and quarantine. So one of the things that Alistair and I have run up against is we have this wonderful library, which is fully searchable online. And it is difficult, if near impossible, to get a book from the collection into somebody's hands without tons of hoop jumping. Not that we are unwilling. It's just very obvious that if someone wants to check out a book, it's not as simple as, well, stop by the house and check out the book. It becomes a whole process. What do you think the role of electronic media, ebooks in particular, might be moving forward for community-based libraries like ours, but also middle school and high school libraries and public library systems? One of the things that I have encountered as an author with Trans Plus was plenty of youth who really wanted to read it, but it was not safe to be seen reading it. Because as much as I love the design of the books, it's pretty obvious what you're reading, right? So a lot of them asked, well, when will it be available on ebook? Because if it's an ebook, then I can read it on my phone and nobody knows. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about the future of library and media and electronic collections and our responsibility. Because I do want to own, and sorry, Alistair, this is the first you're hearing of it. I want to own that I do believe it is our responsibility, given what's happened, that this is a direction that we may have to go. Go ahead, Ashley.
It's a hard question. To address the really direct part of it, I agree with you. I think that electronic materials of any kind, whether that's books, movies, TV, articles, people increasingly rely on those electronically, and that's true, has been true in academic libraries, which is my primary environment for a long time. One of the big roadblocks to this is that not every publisher wants to sell an electronic copy of a book to a library, probably for obvious reasons. So it's a really hot topic right now among librarians and information professionals, just figuring out how we can even continue to acquire electronic copies of the things that our patrons most need, which is heightened now, certainly, but has been true for quite a while for some of the reasons that you mentioned, Catherine. So I wish I had a grand vision or solution in mind. I just kind of wanted to acknowledge one of the hard things about this.
Alistair.
Not to harp on the hard parts of this issue, but subscription costs for like journals or articles or like publishing companies can be really astronomical, which is another roadblock. Something nice about this aspect of everyone kind of shifting to a more digital platform now is that we are getting more access to things than we have in the past. People are making things more readily available, not in physical format, which is nice potentially if we can kind of seize the moment. But I think that it's also something that's difficult and requires a lot of thought and consideration, which I've also been doing alongside Catherine.
Love it when that happens.
I mean, I think the biggest thing is that publishing has been going through a sea change in the way they do things for a while, and they've been really resistant to this. You know, I'm big into comics, and that's a big battleground on that, and they really only made the full leap beyond like archival stuff to digital really in the past 6 months because they had to. There was no choice. There's a weird distribution thing in comics with Diamond where it was basically if Diamond didn't want to play ball, no one got comics. And I think books are going to have to move towards a similar paradigm of just, you know, you're not going to succeed as a business model if you can't adapt to people's needs. I prefer physical books. I absolutely do, but I also prefer being healthy and safe. And that requires giving some things up. I think some of these platforms like Hoopla are also going to need to have formats that are more friendly to institutions that aren't big and have lots of money, because those are things of scale. Like I can't imagine what a single entity Hoopla platform will cost, like OutYouth, for example, versus like a massive public library or public school library system. And those tools, I think, need to be more accessible for this to happen, and agitating to make them more accessible. Like, you know, we made the library work way back because the library thing existed. We had an online platform to organize and sort the collection that wasn't just a stack of cards. That piece of technology changed the game. A collection that size wouldn't have been possible without something like library thing.
Definitely. It is the piece that I want to acknowledge out loud and invite especially librarians in public library institutions to consider. All of my friends here today are correct. The issue is less access and more cost. So one of the things that naturally comes to mind for OutYouth in particular is, well, what if we create a partnership with the Austin Public Library? I know the youth librarians there, and it's something that we would certainly venture into. But then the issue is, does OutYouth become a place that issues Austin Public Library cards? At that point, who owns our collection anymore? Which that one I'm very clear on. We still own the collection. But even the process of getting a library card in Austin is not the easiest and requires a level of access and privilege because you have to physically get to a library location, at least last I checked, for part of the process. You can now do most of it online. Or can you do it all online?
They have an online option for like an online library card where you can, I did that myself at the beginning of quarantine.
Got it. Thank you.
I also think that requires a little tech access though, right? Like I think you have to like give an ID and it requires a scan of it. It's still going to be a barrier that's wrapped up in money and access. And I think the folks who most heavily utilize libraries don't often have those tools.
I see an excellent question in the chat, which we will get to for certain. I want to finish up on this angle. The piece that I have encountered personally and also want to own as someone who had a library card before all of this happened, but then was exploring online resources through the Austin Public Library. Y'all, I am tech savvy. If it has an on and off switch, you can best bet that I'm going to make it work. And even I have difficulty navigating the multiple platforms between like having an Overdrive account for ebooks and maybe audiobooks, I'm not sure. And then there's an RB Digital thing that does magazines and some master class courses somehow, but also British television, Netflix, something. And There's a third app for something else. And then if I want research articles, that's like 17 different databases. So I want to own that we are talking about what would be ideal. And I think the ideal is still maybe a little further away, not only for want of cost and access to materials that publishers do not want to make electronic for obvious reasons, but also in simply, one, getting the card to have access and then actually being able to access it in a way that doesn't make me want to put my foot through my monitor. So we're talking a lot about access and privilege, but Frederick has rightly pointed out and asked, speaking of accessibility, how much of a collection ought to be audiobooks offered in Braille? Things like that. And how? Ashley.
I don't know that there is a set number, but I do feel pretty strongly that it always needs to be reflective of the community's needs as a first point. And secondly, if there are other ready ways in which that type of media can be accessed. I know, for example, that my current institution doesn't do a lot in the way of collecting audiobooks, but APL has a pretty robust way to access audiobooks, I think through ArtView Digital, which you already brought up, and some other ways. So I think that those are two considerations, knowing that some of those materials can be pretty difficult and expensive to acquire. I think it's worth investing in if there aren't other ways that your patrons can very easily access those. But yeah, there's certainly a price associated with it.
Yeah, I'll just kind of echo that as well. I don't think there's necessarily like a hard and fast rule about like percentages or anything like that, but it should be representative. And I think that for audiobooks, they're maybe a little bit more easily available than books in Braille, but that doesn't mean that there aren't like books in Braille that are accessible to you. It's just something that the librarian has to, again, put in the work to find and make accessible for their patrons.
I mean, I think I can count, at least when I was there, on one hand, maybe there was 2 audiobooks, and a big part of that is that a lot of times publishers don't make audio versions unless it's a very successful or heavily published book, and unfortunately that just so much queer content is considered niche or non-mainstream content, and that makes it even more difficult. It has to be a very successful book to get that edition and then to find it. I think this comes back to the importance of digital library access, that if you have an ebook, you can also use a screen reader. Like, getting these things into audio is much easier if there's a digital copy of it. And it's why that's so important that that becomes, I guess, larger volumes of access, and the bar to access needs to go down.
Yes, and one of the things, I have a related question to all of this, and it will be our last question of the day. So we talked a lot about making libraries safer, more accessible to queer folks, accessible to those who may be blind or low vision, QT BIPOC folks, intersex people. We must own that as humans, we are going to have things that we miss, that there will be things that even when we assess our collections and think that we've got it covered, we're going to miss something. So what is the mechanism? What is the recommended mechanism for allowing patron feedback or request? And is that an appropriate thing to request of our patrons? Or is that putting the onus on marginalized people whose needs are being met in order to raise the alarm that they have been forgotten? Right.
This is difficult, right? Because we want their feedback, but we can't rely on it as professionals. Something I did that was very helpful is with the youth over the years, I made it clear that I want to hear what you're reading. I want to hear what you like. I want to hear why you like it. I just want that to be a consistent conversation so that when a youth with a different background and experience than me dramatically, is pointing out these things that they like and they enjoy and that reflect their experiences, I can take note of that. Like I made very clear, you are in control of this collection. I just manage it. So while still doing that research, looking for things that I know better reflect the population, also having that door open to have just a regular dialogue, whether it's send me an email, catch me at drop-in, leave a note with Catherine, just if there's something you love that you're either not seeing or that you found and you want to share, I want to keep having conversations about it.
Actually,
I agree with everything that Brian just said. It's so important to have those types of relationships with your patrons, especially if you're in a small community library like Out Youth is, because you're going to hear from them what it is that they want to see if you have a comfortable relationship with them. I remember getting similar requests from some of the most avid readers among the Out Youth family, and I always really appreciated that. The thing I will add to it is that I think it's also really important to have a mechanism for anonymous submissions, whether that's having a piece of paper that people can write their requests on and put it into a box at the desk, or a Google form that allows anonymous submissions, because not everybody is going to feel comfortable sharing what it is that they're looking for. And I like to make sure that they have a way to do that if they notice gaps in the collection or there's a specific title they really want to see but don't feel super comfortable talking to the librarian about it.
Yeah, I'll just kind of echo everything. I have been very fortunate in that most of the time the youth will just come up and be like, hey, do you have this book? Oh no, can you get it? Okay, thanks. So that's made it really easy. I also think just really listening to the questions that they ask and like what genres they're interested in, like what characters they like to see, whether they're more into maybe graphic novels or nonfiction or biographies. I think just kind of having like a either physical tally or like a mental tally of kind of what is a larger area that people are interested in and kind of making sure that you keep it up. And then also I think anonymous submission requests is super important and a really valuable asset to getting some suggestions.
So we will end things together here, and with a wrapping up point from me on having been involved in the management of the library for a decade now, not as the librarian, but being around. I love this point that you've made about having personal relationships with the people that are accessing your library, because there is nothing more touching to me than knowing that the librarians that I have had the honor to work with over all of these years are having those conversations. And yes, we acquire books that have been specifically requested by title. But even more magical is knowing that our librarians listen and are aware of the broader themes. And then we bring in things on those themes and see someone light up to discover something in our library that they wouldn't have encountered absolutely anywhere else. To be able to meet that need and to give people a mirror in book form that they didn't even know that they were looking for. It is quite magical. So thank you all for joining us today. If you have any additional questions for our panelists, you can send those along through the Q+EDU website, or if you have specific questions about the Out Youth Jerry Strickland Jr. Memorial Library, you can send those questions to librarian@outyouth.org. If you live in Austin and would like to access the collection, you can visit outyouth.org. Under our programs page, you will find the library section and you can search the online collection from there. Thank you all for being here today. So wonderful to see your faces, and I do hope we get to gather together soon. Maybe we'll have a get together at the Austin Public Library once we're all able to get back in person again and go hunting through the stacks for things we need to add to the library.
That sounds like so much fun. I'm totally in. I did want to share with y'all, I'm putting it in the chat, a book that I learned about yesterday on our session, Queer-Friendly Approaches to Religion. The book is called Where Pride Dwells, and it's a huge collection of LGBTQ plus affirming Jewish prayers. And there's prayers for binding and prayers for, you know, going to the doctor, and just, I was really excited when I heard about it. So that was one book that I wanted to introduce to y'all, because apparently it's super new. I did also want to invite all of the folks watching to join us for our upcoming Q Plus EDU sessions. Tomorrow is going to be Children's Agency Over Gender Through Art. That's going to be at 6 p.m. Central Time. And then on Friday, our final session this week at 6 p.m. is Decentering Whiteness and Queerness. So really important conversations, and we do love feedback. So I'm sharing the feedback form in the chat as well. We would love to hear from y'all. And this video of this recording should be posted within a week or two. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate it, and really appreciate all the work you do for Out Youth and our books and libraries and all our little baby queers. Have a good one, y'all.